Hi, I'm Donna Warren with the Critical Thinking Center at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and this is the second in a series of videos about how to evaluate arguments. In our first video, we saw that an argument is a unit of reasoning that attempts to establish that one claim, which we often call the conclusion, is at least probably true. A good argument succeeds in doing that. A bad argument does not succeed in doing that. In order to evaluate arguments, we saw that we can look at a premise. A premise is something that the argument takes for granted. And once we see those things, we can ask, is it true? If in fact a premise is probably not true, then that means that the line of reasoning is bad. And if the argument has only one line of reasoning or one path to the conclusion, then the argument as a whole is bad. We also saw that arguments that are bad can have true conclusions. So just because we decide that an argument is bad, we should not thereby conclude that the conclusion of the argument is false. We should just think that the argument has not established that the conclusion is true. It might be true, it might be false. The reason that the argument's bad is that it doesn't help us to decide that question. Okay, so here is another argument. This one's a little bit more complicated. God exists is the conclusion. The reason for the conclusion, God exists, is this holy text says that God exists. The holy text can be whichever holy text you choose to imagine. The holy text says that God exists. Everything that the holy text says is true, and I know that because the holy text is divinely inspired. So do you see how this works? The holy text is divinely inspired, so everything it says is true. One of the things it says is true is that God exists, so God must exist. This argument is more complicated, at least in part, because it has this claim here. Everything that this holy text says is true. This is not a premise. The only two premises in the argument are those, right? Because those are the only claims that the argument is not supporting with another claim. The conclusion, God exists, is obviously supported by these claims. This claim, everything this holy text says is true, is in turn supported by this claim. This claim, this holy text is divinely inspired, has no support. The argument's taking it for granted. Similarly, this holy text says that God exists also has no support. The argument is just taking it for granted. By the way, that's perfectly legit, right? We have to start reasoning somewhere. So it's always okay to take something for granted. The question is, are we taking the things for granted that we should be taking for granted? And are we not taking for granted things that we shouldn't be taking for granted? So far, we have one question to ask of premises. Is it true? I think that question's not going to be quite enough. And in order to see why not, let's just take a look at this argument again and ask yourself, does it seem to be a good argument or a bad argument? Don't even worry about premises right now. Just ask yourself, does this argument do the thing that an argument is supposed to do? Does it establish that its conclusion is at least probably true? So if you want to pause the video for a moment now and think about that, go ahead. Okay, so what do you think? Good argument? It's easy to think that it's a good argument. And when I present this argument to my students, lots of them think that it's a good argument. It's the kind of thing that we hear people say. In fact, it's not a good argument. It's a bad argument. Now, I really want to stress here, remember the point that we just recapitulated and that we saw in our previous video? To say that an argument's bad is not to say that the conclusion is false. So when I say that this argument's bad, which it is, I'm not saying that God does not exist. What I'm saying is this argument does not establish that God exists. It doesn't give us good, independent reason to think that God does exist. Why not? You can think about that for a moment and pause the video if you want. Give it some thought. Okay, what did you decide? Is it because one of the premises is false? Well, let's see. This holy text says that God exists. Now, I don't know what holy text you happen to have in mind, but the holy text that I happen to have in mind absolutely does say that God exists. I mean, if not in so many words, that sort of permeates the text, right? So I think we can say that that's true. What about this? This holy text is divinely inspired. Is that true? Well, that's a really hard question. And luckily, we don't have to answer it because whether it's true or whether it's false, it presupposes that the conclusion is true. Do you see how it does that? Do you see how this premise presupposes that the conclusion is true? If God does not exist, then how on earth could any text be divinely inspired? One way that we can see this is asking ourselves, if someone doesn't already believe the conclusion, someone doesn't think that God exists, could that person think that a holy text is divinely inspired? I think not. That means that this conclusion, we can say, this premise rather, we can say assumes the conclusion. It assumes the conclusion. The fact that this premise assumes the conclusion is enough to have us say that this argument is bad. Why? Well, because an argument is supposed to establish that the conclusion is probably true. This argument doesn't. This argument presupposes that the conclusion is true. Rule of thumb, you can't establish what you presuppose, right? So we now have our second question to ask of any premise. In addition to asking, is it true? We can ask, could someone who doesn't already believe the conclusion think that this is true? If the answer to that's no, someone who doesn't already believe the conclusion could not conceivably accept this premise, then we know that the premise assumes the conclusion. The argument presupposes what it is attempting to establish, and you can't establish what you presuppose, right? By the way, I think an important thing to notice about these two questions about premises is sort of the intellectual shape-shifting that it requires us to do. When we ask ourselves, is it true? We are thinking with our own heads, sort of from our own unique perspective. Do I think this is true? Do I have good reason to think that this is true? When we ask, could someone who doesn't already believe the conclusion think that this is true? We might have to put ourselves in the head of someone who sees the world very differently than we do. If I happen to believe that God exists, and if I happen to believe that very strongly, putting myself in the head of someone who doesn't believe that God exists can be difficult for me to do unless I've practiced that skill. And if I can't put myself in the head of someone who doesn't already believe the conclusion, then I can't really effectively evaluate the premises because it will be so natural for me to just think, well, this is obviously true. Everyone would accept this, right? No, not someone who doesn't believe the conclusion, right? By the way, that habit of just being able to see the world in ways that might not be the way you naturally see the world, that's a habit that can be developed. You can get really, really good at it if you just practice doing it. And one way to practice doing it is when you evaluate arguments, ask yourself two questions of the premises. Do you think it's true? You, in your own head. Second, could someone who doesn't already believe the conclusion think that it's true? And if you happen to believe the conclusion, well, then good news. You get to pretend that you're somebody else and develop that skill. So I hope you enjoyed this. There's more to talk about when we think about evaluating arguments, and we'll be doing that next time. But as far as premises go, that's pretty much all we really need. See you later. Hang in there. Have fun. Bye-bye.